Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the President of the United States.
I was born a little over a month after this election, and it seems to me that they've only gotten closer and crazier since. But I believe that calmer times are ahead. And regardless of what happens in the next 4 years, one thing is certain that Donald Trump will not be on the ballot in 2028, and he will exit to the wings a little over 13 years since he first descended onto the political stage. And when that time comes, the conservative movement needs to be ready to continue as a political philosophy rather than just another populist movement, if we are to avoid a repeat of conservative failure in the decades following Reagan. The question in 2028 needs to be about what are we voting for rather than who we are voting for. Because Republicans have been using the same rhetoric for almost 40 years and have failed to make any meaningful progress for the movement. And all we seem to do is idolize figures like Reagan and Trump to cope with the sustained philosophical L's that we have been taking for damn near a whole century. There's a reason liberals don't idolize FDR the same way that conservatives idolize Reagan, because his political philosophy has been doing all of the talking for him. And I believe the only way to go against that current is to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we talk about conservatism? And this video seeks to answer that question by referring back to the roots of modern American conservatism as they were articulated by Barry Goldwater. His book, The Conscience of a Conservative, has been an amazing guide for me as I have tried to develop my own personal political philosophy, and I hope that you can be as interested in his writings as I am because of the way that they speak to problems that still exist today, 55 years after it was originally written. In this episode, we're going to begin by establishing the philosophy and the issue of power in the mind of a conservative. Barry Goldwater is a fascinating character who will be getting a video to himself eventually. But all you need to know for now is that he was a 1964 Republican candidate that got blown out by LBJ. He is considered a conservative of libertarian leaning and is as principled in his beliefs as they come. He opens his book by stating that he isn't interested in adding, improving, or updating conservative philosophy. Rather, he is writing to talk about the challenge to, quote, demonstrate the bearing of a proven philosophy on the problems of our own time, unquote. He is seeking to give us actionable steps because he believes that America is a fundamentally conservative nation that is yearning to return to better times and is tired of the never-ending forward movement of liberals. Despite that feeling, his frustration and the frustration of many conservatives is the failure to turn what is believed to be at least the natural belief of most people in the country into meaningful action. And his diagnosis of that problem is that conservatives suck at making their ideology seem practical, even though it is the result of all of human experience. For Goldwater, it's simple. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but what we do have to do is, quote, attempt to apply the wisdom and experience and the revealed truths of the past to the problems of today, unquote. And chapter 1 begins this process by explaining what I believe is the most important concept for conservatives to understand, which is that conservatism is not an economic theory. We've fallen into this trap far too often, and this is excellent ammo that is frequently used against us. The example that he uses is how then Vice President Nixon stated that we should be, quote, economic conservatives, but conservatives with a heart. And President Eisenhower stated, I am conservative when it comes to economic problems, but a liberal when it comes to human problems. Statements like these make it seem like conservatism, as a philosophy, is simply about maximizing the economy and the material well-being of the richest among us. This thinking weakens the support of the philosophy and gives the Democrats an easy layup to paint the picture that Republicans only care about the wealthy and that it is in fact they that represent the common man's interest. But if we actually understand our philosophy, we know that there is no need to apologize or preference our beliefs because we are fighting for what is most important, the liberty of what Goldwater calls the whole man. Of course, our philosophy is going to have economic implications, but those specific accusations of a prioritization of material possessions, in my opinion, is more fitting of progressives today who place that above all other considerations. Conservatism, by contrast, places more emphasis on the spiritual needs of people to be free and to be individuals. This quote sums it up nicely. The first thing he has to learn about man is that each member of the species is a unique creature. Man's most sacred possession is his individual soul, which has an immortal side, but also a mortal one. The mortal side establishes his absolute differentness from every other human being. Only a philosophy that takes into account the essential differences between men and accordingly makes provision for developing the different potentialities of each man can claim to be in accord with nature. I bet you didn't read that in political philosophy, but it is this idea that separates conservatives from their counterparts on the left. Individualism is king, and that is why conservatives are so fixated on preserving those freedoms. And it is also this emphasis on individualism that I believe you could base your assumption that America is a conservative nation on. We live in such an individualistic culture, and having a belief system that prioritizes that will naturally always have a foothold with the population. A conservative should seek to allow a person to be politically free and economically free at the same time, and a conservative should not believe that an outside force or pressure can ever make a person achieve some desired outcome. For a conservative, people cannot be viewed as pawns for another's gain and are not a collective devoid of separate identities. Goldwater states conservatives should be, quote, at odds with dictators who rule by terror and equally with those gentler collectivists who ask our permission to play God with the human race. What he outlines there is the perfect balance of a conservative, the ability to be sympathetic to the poor peasants from the French monarchy, while being, quote, revolted at the attempt to solve that problem by a mob tyranny. This shows us that conservatives have the ability to recognize issues and feel the pain of the less fortunate, but are very careful about the methods they seek to use to deal with those issues. Goldwater's overall argument against socialism is that they fight against the nature of man because they are quick to use the tools of politics and the economy to force a collective push for, quote, progress. And a conservative has a lot of issues trying to deal with the beliefs of a collectivist because, as Goldwater states, quote, to regard man as part of an undifferentiated mass is to consign him to ultimate slavery, unquote. The conservative should be aware of anybody who seeks to solve problems through the diminishing of the identity of individuals. It is this situation that we find the basis for the fear conservatives have with centralized power. This leads right into chapter 2, where Goldwater offers his criticism of the tendency for power in centralized places to grow. His biggest grievance against the government of his time comes to the way that figures in both parties talk about the role of government. You know, we can expect him to not approve of the way that the Democrats view the government, but what actually bothered him the most was the way that Republican leaders were undermining the principle of limited government. Goldwater seems to me to have a bone to pick with the Eisenhower administration and many Republicans of the 1950s, because they, like the Democrats, make no reference to the Constitution when deciding what the government should be doing. They ask the wrong question about government by assuming the government just does whatever needs to be done rather than asking what can they actually do according to the Constitution. This thinking has led to a runaway state where the government gets to decide what the government needs to be doing rather than adhering to the principle of limited government that our founders worked so hard to create. It is a core conservative belief that power corrupts people, and that is why the government cannot be blindly trusted. Conservatism, however, is not any form of anarchism because we acknowledge that government is needed and in fact even contributes to the creation of freedom, but only when it is carrying out the legitimate functions that it has been given. The Constitution is our ultimate safeguard against so many types of issues that countries have experienced with people trying to centralize power. From the mob tyranny to self-seeking dictators, the Constitution, conservatives know, is the best way to cope with the natural habits of people in power. Here's a quote that I believe summarizes these thoughts very well. Goldwater believes that we have not kept it because we have allowed the federal government to expand far beyond the limits set to it by the Constitution. But what is most important for conservatives to understand is the reason that people have been willing to compromise the Constitution. People will agree to almost anything that they believe grants them a greater sense of security, regardless of the potential consequences in the long term. And the fact that people see no other viable alternative is damning for the conservative movement because it means that our messaging is fundamentally broken. And the only way to build a strong, conservative coalition is to unite under one solid philosophical banner rather than 100 small, short-lived ones. Because we should realize that the problems facing our country are not new and have been visible as far back as the 1830s. Goldwater concludes his second chapter by citing Alexis de Tocqueville, who stated that American decay would come from America producing, quote, not tyrants, but guardians, unquote, where we choose the people as a collective to be the holders of our chains. It is with this observation that the need for recognizing people as individuals becomes most important for conservatives, because by referring to people as unique individuals, we can better communicate that our political philosophy is truly seeking their best interest, liberty. And that is a concept that can go far, regardless of who is on the ballot.